Hi, my name is Phil. I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor, a trauma therapist, a supervisor. I'd like to speak today a little bit about how our responses to situations are limited by our psychological process and how that can keep us trapped in feelings or situations that aren't helpful for us. If we think about early development, children who are brought up in nurturing, warm, caring environments where there's a lot of consistency tend to be able to develop a sense of self that helps them to regulate their emotions, from internally as they get older. So they won't be reliant all of the time on their parents telling them that they're okay, they're safe, they're good, they're not bad, they will be able to reassure themselves because that was modeled for them. They believe in themselves, they trust what their feelings are telling them, and they can regulate them. If children aren't brought up in those environments, or those environments are dangerous or hostile, that child might develop behavioral responses to cope because they aren't getting the sort of reassurance from the environment that of how to keep safe. They can't reassure themselves from within, so it has to come from a behavior. So because these behaviors are developed in infancy, that means that they're childish. They're immature. So if we these behaviors become defaults and we take them into adulthood, we're going to be responding to situations from a very immature place, which is going to limit our possibilities of how we deal with that situation. So, I mean, some examples of this would be the first would be someone who maybe a small child who's in their room and they hear a lot of arguing and shouting going on in the house outside. So that child might become very frightened by hearing all of that aggression in the environment. So it might hide itself under the bedclothes. Now, that's a very optimal freeze response. Animals, of course, will freeze, if there's a predator circling because they think that will be the way to survive. The child brain is likely to go to that situation because it's immature and also it hasn't got other options. It can't fight, it can't escape because the trouble is outside the door. It can't appease the parents when there's nobody there. So freeze is maybe the only option. But that might develop into being a pattern of behavior in adulthood, you see. So what might happen as an adult, that person hearing angry voices or the threat of aggression it's perceiving in the environment might trigger their historical behavior, which will make them want to isolate. Now, they may not go back to their bed, but they might go back to their home or a safe place that they have. And it might be a trouble for them to come out of there for a time because they won't be able to regulate themselves from within. They need to be in that safe place. The behavior of going back to that place is what's regulating them, not them. So they're dependent on that safe place in effect. So the immature defense is actually stopping them from having better options. So they aren't able to think like an adult that, hold on a minute, I could probably deal with this person that's being aggressive. I'm a big person now, I've got different options. I could go to the police, I could go to a friend and talk to them. But because they couldn't do any of that when they were a child, because none of those options were available, they won't do them as an adult because the default is the child defense. So if you also think about children who have abandonment needs from childhood, they will often be seeking the unmet needs that they didn't get from their parents in very immature ways as well, and that they would be clingy, demanding behaviours, obsessional behaviours. They may be having tantrums if you're not showing them enough attention, or if you've spoken to a friend of theirs, they might feel very insecure and throw a tantrum to control you back into seeing them as the centre of attention. So of course this is very, very immature behaviour, very, very young stuff, but it's their only option they have. That's the way that worked to get them some attention when they were a child. So the default tells them this is how I have to act now. They aren't, because they're in that place of regression, like the scared child was. They can't think like an adult. They're back in that infancy, being abandoned at that point, and you're the one that's abandoning them. So they need to act out in the way they did then to get their needs met. They can't think another way. If you also think of the people who might be running around helping everybody and trying to fix others, they might have developed that behavior as a response to that was the only way they could survive in the environment because no one else was doing anything. No one else was cooking the dinner for their siblings. The parents couldn't be bothered, or they were ailing, or they were constantly in some sort of victim position, which was inviting people to take on board all their responsibility. This child has found a sense of survival by keeping other people alive. So, that child might, behind all of the caregiving and looking after people, it's a genuine fear that if I don't do this, people are going to die, which is probably a split off belief that I'm going to die if I don't do this, because, who's going to feed me? So I need to grow up to be an adult very quickly or a parent very quickly. It's not parenting my parent, but it's a behavior, you see. and they will get locked in that behavior. And it's really hard for people who are in that process to be praised for all the hard work they do, because they never got praised for it. It was just expected again the next day. They won't be able to hold the praise. They won't think they're good enough because they were never made to feel good enough. The behavior of the doing behavior, which will burn them out, is the way that they're coping. So if you also think of people like with maybe narcissistic processes, of course they're doing the same thing. They're immature behaviors of trying to get, to be seen as the best person in the room, the biggest character, the most interesting person. These are behaviors which will probably been played out around the dinner table when they were trying to outdo their brothers for their parents' attention, trying to get your story in before your brothers. So as adults, they will talk over people. They will try to be the center of attention in the room. But these behaviors, like the others, they're very immature. And often people within the room will feel that around them. They won't sense that in themselves. They'll feel like, because they're in that child defense, they will feel that it's appropriate that they just break into your conversation and start talking about themselves, because that's how the 4-year-old child within them survived. That's how they got some sort of attention need met. So when we're thinking about these defenses and these patterns and these responses, we need to consider regression as being the main factor here, because when we regress, we lose the sense of self, who we are in this moment. Say if we were 40 now and we regress to a 5-year-old, 35 years of emotional experience and everything has all gone out of our brain at that moment. If we regress to a 5-year-old, we're in the 5-year-old's world and we're reacting to that world as though they're the only options we've got, the options that we had when we were 5. Same as like if we regress to a 2-year-old, we might become very frozen because that's the only option that 2-year-old had. The adult isn't going to give you other options because the adult isn't there. You regressed. You've gone into a place of regression, and that's what keeps us stuck. It's because we're stuck in these regressive patterns, and once we go into regression, we haven't got the capacity to think more adult, to give ourselves other options because we're not adult anymore. So we just want to be trying to get our head around that concept and challenging ourselves when we feel ourselves going into these behaviors, or if we recognize we're doing this stuff, if we can actually think and try to break that cycle by just being a little bit more logical, that brings a little bit more adult in. Now that might give you another option, but when you're in a place of regression, of course your brain is thinking it needs to do that immature behavior to survive. It's the only way you've got of regulating your system, or of keeping safe, or absolutely not being killed by someone in the environment. So the regressive behavior is going to be priority for a while. So to challenge that, we just need to get better at thinking adult, understanding our process, talking to people about it rather than reacting. Try to change some of these defaults over time. But like I say, it's going to be difficult because your brain ain't going to want to do that. If we go into regressive positions, those feelings are going to be important at that point. I hope that's sort of understandable for you. I know it's a very complex subject, and I will do some more videos on regression because it is important for us to understand when this is happening. And usually if we can, and we can, bring in that logical voice, it can help. Well, okay. Well, thanks for listening, and I shall do another one shortly.